Elder Paisios of Mount Athos, Spiritual Counsels, Volume 4, Family Life, Part 5, The Trials in Our Life, Chapter 4, Spiritual Laws. Yonder, which laws are called spiritual laws? I will explain them to you. Just as we have physical laws in nature, we also have spiritual laws in spiritual life. For example, when someone throws a heavy object into the air as high as he can, with as much force as he can, that same object will fall back down with all the more force and be shattered into pieces. This is a law of physics. In spiritual life, the more one exalts himself with pride, the greater his spiritual fall will be. And analogous with the height of his pride, he too will be shattered into pieces. For the proud rise, reaching a point, and then they fall, crushed to the ground. For everyone that exalts himself shall be abased. This is a spiritual law. But there is a very significant difference between physical laws and spiritual laws. While physical laws do not contain compassion, and people cannot change them, spiritual laws do contain compassion, and a person can certainly change them, for he can interact with his Creator and most compassionate God. If a person could realize at once the rising of his pride and say, "My God, I have nothing of my own, and I am full of pride. Forgive me," the compassionate hands of God will take hold of him immediately and set him down gently, without making his fall noticeable. In this way he will not be crushed, since with the repentance he has shown, the crushing of his heart had already taken place. The same holds true for the saying of Jesus in the Gospel, "For all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword." In other words, if I offer a sword, by law I must pay with the sword. But when I become aware of my mistake, my conscience drives a sword into my heart, and I ask forgiveness from God. Then the spiritual laws cease to function, and I receive God's love as balsam. In other words, through the abyss of God's judgments, we see God change when people change. When the unruly child comes to his senses, repents, and is censured by his conscience, then his father caresses him with love and consoles him. It is not an insignificant thing for a person to be able to change the decision of God. Do you do evil? God gives you a smack. Do you say, "I have sinned"? He gives you blessings. Some people, even though they have repented for some mistake and God has forgiven them, in which case the spiritual laws have ceased to function, nevertheless do not forget their mistake. It is as if they insist that they be punished in this life for their mistake and thus pay off their debt. Since they insist, the good God fulfills this noble request of theirs, but keeps this payment for them with interest in his heavenly treasury in paradise. Such are the noble youths of God, those among his children who have the most philotimo. In the Limonarion, for example, there is a story about Avapimen, the shepherd. He once received a visitor at his cell who requested hospitality. As the father did not have a separate space for hospitality, he arranged for his guest to stay in his monastic cell while he went to spend the night in a nearby cave. In the morning, when he returned, the guest asked him, "How did you pass the night, Father? Were you cold?" "No, I had a good night. I entered the cave and found a lion sleeping. I lay down beside him and leaned on the mane on his back. The lion's breath kept the cave very warm, and I wasn't cold. But weren't you afraid that the lion would attack you? The guest asked. And Abba-Piman answered, No, but I want you to know that one day I will be eaten by beasts. How do you know that? So Abba-Piman explained, When I was a shepherd in the world, my dogs ripped a passer-by to shreds. And while I could have saved him, I just stood there indifferently. Ever since then, I constantly ask God to let the wild beasts kill me, and I believe that God will grant me this wish. Indeed, Abba-Piman was in the end killed by wild beasts. But in the other life, such noble people will be in the most exceptional place. Yolanda, I read in the comments on some patristic book that a person must be punished when he commits a sin in order to pay for the evil he has done. No, it isn't like that. If the person repents, he is not punished. Christ is merciful and forgiving. One must be careful with such comments, because the commentator may be pretty good at his work, but he can also make mistakes in his interpretation. If one is not certain about the commentator, it is better to stay with the original text. Someone told me that the prophet Isaiah was sawed in two because he had to be sawed for the sins of the people. In fact, the prophet himself asked God that he be sawed for the sins of the people, and God succumbed to the great love the prophet had for the people. But for every cut of the saw, God gave the prophet a wreath. It is essential for one to know certain things in order to be able to understand some others. Abba-Piman, whom I mentioned earlier, could understand the prophet Isaiah, even though his case was different, because in prophet Isaiah's case there was a sacrifice for the sake of the people. Yolanda, do we have such instances in our own times? Yes, of course. I remember an event which took place when I was at the monastery of Philotheu. Some monk, when he was still in the world, had burned a Turk in the oven for having killed his father. He later repented, came to the holy mountain, became a monk, and made a good start. But day and night he prayed that God would permit him to die through fire. At one time the monastery caught on fire. I was then serving as a keeper of the vessels. I prepared the vessels with water, and we all ran to put out the fire. In the end, we found the monk had burned to death. The scene has remained indelibly in my mind. What had happened? That monk was then 85 years old and was being ministered to by another monk who was 75. On that day, in order to provide some relief from the pain of rheumatism, the 75-year-old monk had rubbed the older monk's feet with petrol and placed him near the fireplace. A spark flew from the chestnut logs in the fireplace, starting the fire that burned both him and the entire monastery. I was very troubled over the event and could not find peace. Later, my spiritual father reassured me, do not be upset over this. This monk was asking in his prayers to be burned in order to atone for his sin. It was a gift from God. Yolanda, do spiritual laws always work immediately? It depends. One often wonders about these things. While one person may have felt a little proud, he was immediately crushed. The spiritual laws worked with lightning speed. For example, one of the sisters may be cleaning the windows, and the prideful thought comes to her mind that she can clean the windows better than the others. Then something happens and, crack, she breaks the window. Other times, the laws function more slowly. Yolanda, what does it mean when the spiritual laws work immediately? It's actually a good thing. Then a person ought to be aware of God's love protecting him because he pays off his debt slowly and won't need to pay everything at once in the end. But when the spiritual laws do not work for someone, it is dangerous, for it indicates that this person, this child of God, has distanced himself from him. He is not dwelling in his Father's house. There are some who constantly act with pride, and no harm ever comes to them. This means that their pride has surpassed the human level and has reached its highest degree, which is demonic pride and conceit. In this case, the fall takes place on the other side of the summit. It's a fall directly into hell. It is a satanic fall, not seen by those who are on the other side of the summit. These people do not come under the spiritual law in this life. For them, the apostolic saying applies. Evil men and impostors shall wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. Reference 2 Timothy 3:13. Yeronda, is it possible for someone to admire his own work and have some harm come about? Yes, because spiritual laws are in effect. God removes his grace from him and causes the harm in order to bring him to his senses, because he had become prideful about his work. In other words, Yeronda, when some harm is done, it means that spiritual laws have been enacted naturally. Isn't it possible that someone is simply clumsy and causes harm? Such cases are rare. This is why you must try to live as humbly as you possibly can. Keep in mind that we have nothing of our own. God has given us everything. Whatever we have is God's. Only the sins are ours. If we do not humble ourselves, spiritual laws will be in constant effect for us until our ego caves in. May God grant that this happens before death takes us. Yeronda, is it possible for man not to understand that spiritual laws have been activated? If someone is not in tune with himself, he won't be able to understand anything, and nothing will help him or benefit him. In other words, Yeronda, spiritual laws cease to function only when a person finally becomes truly humble. Yes, especially with humility, or when someone is not fully responsible for his actions. Let me give you an example. There was a woman who would often beat her husband, and he never spoke up, fearing he would lose his dignity. He was a teacher, you see. But the spiritual laws were at work with him. His father died when he was young, and his widowed mother used her only pension to try to educate her son so that he could become a teacher. Instead, he bet her. His mother had suffered so much. Consequently, God permitted that his wife beat him to pay off his debt. And then what happened? He died, and his son started beating his mother. In this manner, she too was given the opportunity to pay off her debt. The son got married to a simple-minded woman who would beat him while singing "Christ is risen." God so provided that he too would pay off his debt. But at that point, the spiritual laws had come to an end because the simple-minded wife had extenuating circumstances, so she was not fully responsible for her actions. Yeronda, when someone falls, sins, and then repents, does he settle his debt? Does he feel that indeed he has a debt to pay off, or is he just feeling selfishly sorry? If he sincerely feels that he has a debt to pay off, he will not pay him. But when he does not acknowledge his debt, God provides for him to pay. A Christian, for example, has an obligation to offer works of mercy. If someone is hard-hearted and doesn't give to charity, but rather hoards his money, thieves will come who will beat him up and take his money. This is how he will fulfill his debt to spiritual laws. It's a very bad sign not to pay for these debts in this life. It indicates abandonment by God. And again, when someone does not receive disciplinary smacks, but rather blessings, then this indicates that he has done something good, and for that he is being rewarded here by Christ twice and thrice over. However, he is not paying off any debts for his mistakes and sins, and this again is a bad sign. Let's say that I have accomplished 10% of charitable deeds, and Christ rewards me for 20%, and I have no sorrows or worries, then I do not pay off any debt derived from my sins. Saint Isaac the Syrian says that suffering in this life consumes hell. That is to say, when the spiritual laws are in effect for someone's life, a portion of his suffering in hell is removed.